most have in memory what is the purloined letter. But remember, in the situation, which concerned the tale of a particular message, a love letter, to avoid being caught by the king, the queen, who has been reading a letter from her lover, hurriedly turns the letter upside down. The minister that's present becomes aware of the letter because of the hiding and takes it in front of the queen, who can say nothing, otherwise she would be disclosed. While the queen sees it and does not dare say a word. All the readers of the story know about the message. All what we know that it must not circulate. The minister hides the letter in his home, and the police, called by the queen, tries to find it. Months pass, and they cannot find the hidden letter, which all along is quite visible, hanging on the wall. The very fact that the letter is openly visible conceals it. What interests Lacan is that the message is written on a material object, which allows it to be passed around beyond the dialogue between the queen, the lover, the king. Lacan detaches himself from the story's protagonists. Any message, even though reduced to small alphabetic letters, always travels with constraints. Something stands in the way of circulation. It leads to the message turning around in circles. And in this way, Lacan presents memory of the unconscious. This is not a memory which flows by efferent nerves from perception to action. It's a circuit which had no end, essentially marked by the impossibility of circulation at given moments. In this reference, so Lacan includes this cybernetic experiment of the time with these reverberant circuits. Lacan is not interested in a memory as a system of new translation, or, as we say now with neuro-metaphors, reconsolidations of memory. He is interested, rather, in a system in which impossibilities or holes appear. These holes that are the rim of these loops, these memory lapses, are what could function in the language apparatus. He takes this up again in Littérateur, or in a text of the same period entitled The Mistaking of the Subject Supposed to Know. The mistaking. And he notes there, impossible to rediscover the unconscious without running the whole gamut, since it is its function to erase the subject. The translation is to run the gamut, is in French, la gomme, which the eraser. And he say, this reminds us that the unconscious is not losing memory. It is not recalling oneself from what one knows. Unquote. I say it again. Allow the emergence of any contour. It represents my representation there where it lacks. Precisely. What Lacan points out is that where there is no representation, where the subject cannot represent itself, in the whole that's marked by the loop, there he is beyond any forgiveness, In this presentation, the described linguistic system is full of holes, replacing Lacan's first presentation of the unconscious as circuitous loops. The subject is unable to recall itself, se rappeler, from the signifier, as, say, in alpine rappelling. You've got to throw the rope and then you can climb on it. We use this metaphor. It's a bad metaphor, but at least it's not a neuro one. The signifier from which I recall myself, it's over there. It's a handhold from which I'm going to hang. I don't recall myself from that place. It does not pre-exist, if I may say it that way. It does not pre-exist my action of holding onto it. I must first be able to hang there. And should there be nothing to hold on to, I cannot recall myself from it. And I remain in the hole, in the ravine where I'm stuck. I cannot extract myself from it. Extract myself from what? From the jouissance of the very whole, the lapse in memory where I am. If I'm stuck there, I have nothing more to say. I am under the effect of an absolute light which holds me motionless, and I can no longer represent myself in any way. The unconscious is not weak or shadowy. It's that instant when there are no longer any words that can be used to construct a representation. I am left blanked out in this hole that Lacan calls in littérature the cup or the gully. Frege marked the place of the argument in a logical function. Letters are made for that. They punctuate hole in the language, not at all like the impression in Freud's magic block. Logic is the device which allows us to make holes in language, at least in the Western tradition. In Oriental tradition, the function of the whole, the letter and its functions are embodied in the brushstroke. Aristotle's logic allowed him to show what was true for the concept of all. All men are mortal. You can substitute instead of men, you can have a whole. All X are mortal. Frege and the tradition he generated showed the function and the whole in the argument as introducing the letter as a replacement for a family of synonyms, a family of arguments entering the function. The logical calculation leads to the production of several ruptures in language, and Lacan connects modern literature with the discovery of the modern logic. Modern literature, that is the post-Joycean literature. Lacan says, quote, does not sustain itself by the semblant. Unquote. Avant-garde literature does not create the new semblances typical of the old love stories. Lacan keeps a distance also from the literature, he says, quote, "It proved nothing except ruptures, which only a discourse can produce with an effect of production," and says that literature tries to mimic the power of science and its ability to go beyond meaning. So, if there is a relation between psychoanalysis, logic, and science, it's through these ways of through the different discourses to produce wholes as such. For instance, considering physics, Lacan follows the lead of the great French epistemologist Alexandre Poiré and the French epistemological tradition. Poiré was from Russian origin. Under the aegis of Poiré, Lacan introduces his refusal of the opposition between exact and conjectural science, because what's crucial in the science itself is the introduction of the mathematical symbols. But prior the introduction of mathematical symbols, and prior to the reference of the Huygens clock, which alone gave experimental science its precision, you have first to introduce the void. What Lacan retains from Poiré is, prior to the introduction of the measure and the precision as such, it's the importance of science to establish silence in the heavens and to abolish all significations prior to mathematics. It's only the preliminary void that allows the introduction of the symbol in the real. I quote, "In the birth of the theory of gravitation, it was only on the basis of the extermination of all symbolisms of the heavens that the terrestrial foundations of modern physics could be established, namely, that as long as some requirement to ascribe to the heavenly orbits a perfect shape was maintained, the circle preeminence over the ellipse, from Giordano Bruno to Kepler and from Kepler to Newton, it thwarted the development of the theory Key's equation." But what the idea is with psychoanalysis and its relation to science, we've got to precisely distinguish what is a real whole and a false whole that's introduced in all the weight of the imaginary signification that carry the whole discourse we live in. There are false wholes, like, for instance, when Max Weber speaks about the position of the scientist. He said he has an absolute indifference to the object. That's its definition, its neutrality, distinct from the politics, in his famous text about the scientist and the politician. This neutrality of the scientist, Lacan says it's a false one, because it's sufficient to see that in every big crisis in sciences, the scientists go mad. They pay for it. when there is a crisis in foundation, you have subjective crisis, and Lacan said that cannot be ascribed to the Oedipal metaphor. Psychoses that are not deductible from the subjective history in the relation to the parents, let's put it that way. Also, we've got to be taking into account what are the moments in the history of science in which scientists can feel the anxiety of pursuing their discourse. For instance, the anxiety that was the anxiety of the biologists in the 70s when they discovered they had the power with biological warfare to extinct the human species, or the anxiety of the physics that discovered that with the H-bomb they could wipe out also the species on the planet. And this kind of holes produced with the power of the scientific discourse produces, like it's always the case when there's the hole that's produced, produces anxiety. And there were the crises in which, for instance, in the physics, the great name of Robert Oppenheimer is one of the figures of that time. Or, let's say, the angst of biologists, in which other names could be quoted. Or the angst that happened in the revolution of quantum physics with the silence of Dirac. To feel the difference between what's a real whole and the false wholes has also helped us to see what false wholes can produce the cult of statistical series applied to our field, and the field of the impossible professions that distinguished Freud, that is, the profession that act in a domain of uncertainty, in which this is part precisely of their field of action. So how to decide? This uncertainty brings anxiety. And that's why the practicant in that field welcomed the introduction of statistical series as a solution to relieve them from their anxiety to act. But at final, the result of the introduction of statistical series in these fields of the impossible profession, what they produce is the elimination of the practitioners as such, the replacement of the practitioners by only technical use of the statistical series. In psychiatry, even the use of strict protocol at the end, there is no need whatever for prescribers of psychotropic drugs to be medically qualified or to have any experiment whatsoever of what the pathology means. The bizarre effect of the search for exactitude produces a reverse. We arrive at a state that makes these impossible professions unreal. A way also of making things unreal, to wipe out subjective decisions, is the use of behavioral economics. For instance, when Cass Sunstein, professor in Chicago, wrote the Nudge, Improving Decisions About Health, Wealth, and Happiness, who was one of the counselors in the policies that President Obama wanted to implement. The idea of Sunstein is to make politics less painful the idea is always to use a default position. For instance, the good example that they quote is the retirement reform that was voted in place in 2006 in the United States. Rather than having to sign up voluntarily in a retirement plan, employees are automatically enrolled, retaining the right to leave the plan, but it is expected that by default, they will choose the good solution and not choose the voluntary procedure. The whole system tends to be constructed that way, to use the crucial default position. This position, as a name, it's a fundamental inertia of the subject. And the psychoanalysis works counter to this. Seeing the singularity of the symptom, he moves the subject away from his homeostasis. Our subject is not the same stuff as the subject of the so-called liberal choice, but the subject of forced choice, given that, to satisfy the drive, he has to mobilize his body. To stand by his choice, he has to keep a rapport with life, the movement, the infinity of life, as Georges Canguilhem said, which help us to elude the spell of the death drive manifesting itself in all the false holes that appear in these practices that are the consequences of bad metaphors. Thank you. It's the crucial part to have the opposition between truth, false, and real, vs what? Vs, for instance, it could be symbolic, imaginary. And it's true that, yes, Lacan, I took out this syntagmas of the true whole, the false wholes, and the real wholes from the theory of knots, which I did not develop here. But I use it, the result, precisely, saying that you have a level in which the whole, let's say, the whole psychoanalytical discourse function as the opposition between the level of truth, false, and the level of the real experience of jouissance. Like Miller says in the cover of the new publication of the small book by Lacan, Je parle au mur, which are some extracts of his lessons in a seminar. He summarized this, saying that the patient goes to an analyst and speaks about truth. He wants to speak his truth. Like when Dora went to see Freud and she said, "My father is betraying me. He wants me to go in bed with Mr. K, to have his own way with Mrs. K." And Freud said, "You're right, it's true." When she was precisely presented as a pathological liar by her father, whom Freud had treated before. So he knew, and he said, it's the truth. And she entered, but at the same time, what was presented as this truth was interpreted by Freud in terms of real, of the real drive in the symptom, in the oral satisfaction that Dora was stuck to. And it's like this in psychoanalysis. You enter speaking about truth, you want to say the truth, you desire to say the truth, and what you find is the real. So the whole thing is built along these oppositions. And for instance, the idea that if one thinks that his body is not sufficient. I mean, we all think that we don't have the right body. Even maybe, Marilyn had the same idea. Maybe Natalie Portman also. Who knows? At least she went to have a master in neuroscience. So maybe she was not satisfied completely with the body. We can want to have this perfect body we dream of, and science can help us. Why not? It probably won't change the idea that with the body, this search for the perfect body will never cease, because there will always exist some more enhancing that is presented, some more things to do to have really that perfect body. And the real punctuation of this search will not be the satisfaction of the quest itself, but rather, like you said in the first question, it would be love. The risk is how to love with that body you have, enhance or not enhance. But the risk is to have this body accepted by the loved one and to pass from the register of the truth, true love, to real love, the more dignified love that include the circuit of satisfaction. And how you can find the right partner to shift between the level of truth to the level of the real, from false holes to real holes in the relationship.
We still have, okay, thank you very much.